Hello viewers, 4DIYers here with another tutorial video for everyone. In this particular video here, I'll be doing a demonstration how to repair rust holes on your vehicle's body panels using fiberglass. Now before I do get into this repair, as a disclaimer, this is a budget repair and when done correctly can last for a very long time. However, with that being said, if you are wanting to restore a vehicle properly, then this isn't the repair for you. This is a repair where it can be done at home, doesn't cost a load of money or require any specialty tools, and can easily clean up your vehicle. Fiberglass is strong, so it won't fall out like a body filler even when using a reinforcement mesh. The two main concerns with fiberglass is that it doesn't expand and contract like metal, so the repair may be visible. And it may have bonding issues with the steel, so those areas will be covered in this video. I have used this method in the past on low budget daily drivers without any issues, and it has held up great despite living in an area where the vehicles are exposed to harsh winters. So as you can see here, there's quite a few soft spots along the fender. Unfortunately, with this fender design, the inner fender folds over on the inside, creating a prime spot for dirt to get trapped, holding moisture and eventually rotting out the steel. Luckily, this lip is still salvageable, so it'll be easier to maintain that shape and the body lines. Removing the paint and rust, this can be done by hand or by a machine. You can use anything from a surface sander, such as what I have here, media blasting, orbital sander, etc. When removing material, it's important to wear the proper safety equipment, such as a mask and safety glasses, so you're not exposing yourself to any harmful contaminants. 80 grit sanding discs are used. This will clean up the surface quite quickly. While the surface sander can create heat, you'll need to be careful and minimize this. We want to avoid heat as this can warp the steel. Getting the panel down to the bare metal so you have a good base point on what needs to be cut out and where the rust ends. From the rust damage, there should be about 2 to 3 inches around the area to ensure we have a solid base and didn't miss any rust spots which may jeopardize the repair. Try to clean up the area fairly well. You can go over the area again just before the fiberglass is applied. Using compressed air, blow out any dirt or debris which may be stuck behind the fender. Next, using a die grinder, clean up that rust hole, cutting out some of that thin rusted metal. This pneumatic die grinder is made by OEM Tools, model number 24404 from Mobile Distributor Supply. If you have seen my cab corner video, both the die grinder and surface sander were used there as well. Both these tools work great with a small portable air compressor, so they do fit perfect for anybody working at home. A link to both these products will be included in the description below. Once that rusted metal has been cut out, unfortunately there will most likely be rust in behind that fender, and this can be tough to tackle. Using a media blaster would be the best option, however, that can be messy, and if you don't own that equipment, it can be a bit costly to get into, and I'm trying to keep this as a budget repair. A chemical rust converter can also be used, which I'll be showing here. There are various products on the market available, some do work better than others. This is the same product I used to clean up the rear differential on my Toyota Tacoma, and will be posting a video for that in the future. Application processes will vary. With this product, I dumped a desired amount into a plastic container and then applied it to the surface using a brush. Keep the surface wet. The slower it dries, the longer it can attack that rust. Once it dries, I went over the area again using 80 grit discs and abrasive pads to ensure all the paint is removed and we have bare metal exposed. Just to give you a close-up at the surface sander, this is made by OEM Tools, model number 24417 from Mobile Distributor Supply. This works excellent with those small portable air compressors, is relatively quiet and compact, allowing you to get in those tight areas. Inside that hole and behind that fender, using 80 grit sandpaper to scuff up the surface. A rough surface allows the fiberglass to have a strong bond to the bare metal. If there is paint or primer in between the fiberglass and metal materials, this may give an area for the bond to fail. I'm also wearing gloves, which helps prevent the oil from my skin contaminating the surface. This also can cause adhesion issues. Using a hammer, lightly tap on the edge of the hole. The fiberglass cloth will go in behind and over top of the hole. This will help keep the repair level with the original body shape. Clean the surface using a wax and grease remover and a clean rag. Gloves are highly recommended when working with fiberglass. The fibers can embed in your skin, causing irritation. You'll need to cut up various lengths and sizes This matting cloth will need to be placed across the surface in multiple layers. It's best to have plenty of pieces cut first, as it can be messy if you need additional pieces halfway through patching the holes. Using fiberglass is messy, as the resin will most likely start dripping when applied. Cover up the surrounding areas to help contain that mess. Resin can be tough to clean up when it's dried on a surface or object. For this project, I'm using a polyester laminating resin, which will remain tacky when it dries and can easily have additional layers if desired. Using a mixing container, dump a desired amount of resin. If you do run out of resin partway through, that isn't an issue, as you can always mix more. Don't mix too much, as it can go outside of the resin's work time. Then apply the hardener. The ratio between the hardener and resin can vary between products, and this also depends on weather conditions. More hardener tends to be needed in cooler weather and less in warmer weather, as it cures faster. But if you do add too much hardener, the resin produces heat when curing, so this heat can create warpage on the fiberglass. Too little, and the resin may not cure at all. When the hardener is added, the resin will change color, which is normal. The resin must be well mixed, and try not to cause any bubbling either. Also, when working with fiberglass, work in a well-ventilated area. Using a cheap disposable brush, apply the resin to the surface. This will help stick the fiberglass cloth to that surface. Then apply the cloth. First, you'll need to apply it on the back side. You can pre-soak the cloth, but this can get messy, so I'm taking a slightly cleaner route. The cloth must be fully saturated in resin, otherwise it may not stick on the surface, or its structure will be jeopardized. Using a stir stick, I'm able to maneuver the cloth in behind that panel to stick it in place. The exposed metal edge basically needs to be sandwiched between the fiberglass layers. The more layers of fiberglass, the stronger the repair will be. If there is high spots, this isn't an issue, as it can be ground down afterwards. Once the area is filled up, using painter's tape, lay it over the top. This will help keep the area together, reduce the chance of the edges pulling away before it cures, keeps the bubbling down, and when it's cured, you'll have a smoother surface. Next, working on the other side using the same process. Work time of the resin will depend on how much hardener is mixed in, along with the weather conditions. Dry times will vary. This should be ready to sand in a few hours. However, I will be letting this dry overnight. The hole should be overlapped by at least a couple inches, so there is a good strong bond. If you go past the cloth with the resin, that's not an issue, as it can be sanded afterwards. Remove the tape, and as you can see, the repair has hardened. You can of course hand sand the area, but this does take time. This should be done with 80 grit sandpaper, and I'm using a block backer. This is the same setup that I used on my cab corner replacement video. Or you can use a surface sander to cut down that area quite fast. You'll need to roughen the area first. A filler will take care of the fine work after. Considering the fender shape was gone due to the rusting, this will need to be made again. If you do find any thin areas or holes in the fiberglass, more cloth and resin can be applied. Clean the area using a wax and grease remover. Using a short strand fiberglass filler, this will be used to get the shape back. This is a strong waterproof filler. The mixing ratio for the hardener and filler will be listed on the can, and the filler should be dragged across the surface when mixing so you don't introduce air bubbles in the filler. The filler should be mixed on something which doesn't soak in the resins. I'm using wax paper over a cardboard backer. Then apply the filler to the surface. If you don't get all the spots in the first try, more filler can be applied. You'll have a certain amount of work time when applying the filler. Once it goes past that window, the filler will be hard to work with, and it won't have that bond. Allow the filler to dry, and then block the surface using 80 grit sandpaper. Getting that shape back does take some time, and if you're new to bodywork, it can be tough. It does take patience, time, and always looking at the panel from different angles. Being that this panel isn't one color, this also makes spotting those angles a little tough. Using a coarse sandpaper makes roughing in the shape much quicker, and the sandpaper doesn't tend to plug up as easily. However, when that sandpaper does plug up, you can use a wire brush to clean it. I would recommend wearing gloves. However, at this moment it's quite hot outside, so it's a bit more comfortable without them. On the curved edge, you can use a flexible rubber backer to help achieve that smooth contour. I can already see there are some low areas which will need to be addressed in a moment. Clean the area off using a wax and grease remover, then allow it to evaporate before applying more filler. A fast and efficient way for cleaning up an applicator is by scooping up the remaining filler from your mixing board. Once it dries, bend the applicator and the filler will break right off in large chunks. When the filler is too thin, it can flex with the applicator and can be hard to remove. Apply more filler using the same process as previously, mainly focus on those low areas or any flaws on the surface. Sand the area again using an 80 grit sandpaper. I did end up applying more filler in a couple missed areas. There really isn't a limit as to how many coats you can apply, and I usually try to keep the thickness around 1/8 of an inch or 3 millimeters in total. Now working on the back side, you may need to seal up the surface depending on the fender design. I do have a couple holes on the inner fender, which I won't be patching, but it does expose the backside of the repair and it may allow moisture to penetrate. In order to gain access inside the fender well, plastic covers may need to be removed. For this truck, there is a shield at the front and rear inside that fender. There will be plastic clips that hold these liners in place, and they simply pull straight out. First, using a die grinder with a wire wheel, clean up any dirt or rust on the back side. You'll most likely need to remove the wheel for this, so the vehicle should be safely elevated. Using a wax and grease remover, clean the surface. Here's a quick view on the inside of that fender. Using an etching primer, apply it to the surface. An etch primer is needed on bare metal as it increases the bond for additional products and can help reduce future rusting to some extent. 2 coats are needed. Wait 5 to 10 minutes in between each of those coats. Next, I applied a regular gray primer, which will be a barrier between the etch primer and undercoating. Etch primer can sometimes cause a chemical reaction depending on the products that are used. 2 coats are all that's needed. Again, wait 5 to 10 minutes in between coats. Back on the outside of the fender, considering it is getting late, I like to seal up the surface to some extent from the elements. Sand the fender down using 180 grit and then finish up with 220. There is bare steel, however there is also filler and paint, so an etch primer can't be used as it can sometimes create a chemical reaction. So a filler primer is being used instead to seal up the surface. Feather in the existing paint's edge so we have a smoother transition line. Clean the area using a wax and grease remover, then mask off the surrounding area. For masking, I'm using packaging paper, which is cheap and will soak up the paint so there is no risk of any paint flaking off onto the work surface. Place the paper over the area which will be painted, apply the tape, and then fold it back over. This will reduce the chance of a hard tape edge, which can be hard to sand afterwards. Overspray can be removed. This can be done using a wax and grease remover or clay bar. Give the area another wipe down with a wax and grease remover, then apply the filler primer. First applying a light coat, then 2 medium to fully wet coats. You're looking at about 10 to 15 minutes in between coats. This can vary depending on your temperature. Remove the paper within 5 minutes after that final coat. Considering I did leave it for the next day, the primer should be lightly sanded with 400 grit abrasive pads by hand. If you apply the undercoating 20 minutes after that final coat of primer, there's no need for scuffing the surface. If you did scuff the surface, also give that area a wipe down using a denatured alcohol. Mix the undercoating accordingly and spray it on the surface, starting out with a light coat first. Considering it is warmer outside, you'll be looking at about 15 minutes in between each coat. Applying more coating to the surface will leave it smoother, while light coats tends to put more texture on. Once it dries, here's what I'm left with, and it's officially done on the inside. You can use a guide coat on the outside, just like my cab corner video. I know this is fairly close, and can see the high and low areas, therefore I won't bother with a guide coat. Sand the surface using 220 grit sandpaper and backing pad. The edges around the old paint and the repair will need to be feathered in, along with any surface imperfections. If you do sand down through the primer to the bare metal, more primer will need to be applied. Considering this is a fiberglass filler, it is thick and has a higher chance of causing pinholes. These will need to be filled. A spot putty, also referred to as a glazing or finishing putty, will be used here. This can also be used to fill any mildly low areas or any light surface imperfections. A 2-part product is the best option as it's a much better quality product than compared to a single part product. This includes both a filler and hardener. Again, it's mixed by dragging it across the surface until it's a uniform color, and the mixing ratio will usually be printed on the side of the product package. Apply to the surface using a plastic applicator, same way as the fiberglass filler. This filler is much thinner, which allows you to achieve a smoother finish, and it can be feathered in much easier. Again, you'll have a limited work time window, and this will depend on your weather, along with how much hardener has been mixed in. The thickness of the filler should be no thicker than 1/16 of an inch or 1.5 millimeters. Dry times will vary again, however, in general, this should be ready to sand in about 30 minutes. Using 220 grit sandpaper, block the surface using the same process as before, working across the panel, avoiding any waves. If the sandpaper becomes plugged, use a wire brush to clean it. Considering a filler was used again, this can leave outlines in the paint, so a primer is needed. Go over the main area with 320 sandpaper and 400 at the blend points where the transition is between the primer and original paint. Tape the area off just like before. The primer needs to be applied over those 220 and 320 sanded areas, otherwise the sanding marks will show through on that final paint finish. The area will need to be cleaned using a denatured alcohol to remove any contaminants. Apply the filler primer. Primer colors can vary depending on the final color of your vehicle. I'll cover that for another video. This is black, so it does cover fairly well over a white filler primer, so it's not an issue. You'll be looking at about 3 coats. 1 light coat, and the other 2 will be a medium to fully wet coats. 5 to 10 minutes in between each of those coats, and try to avoid any runs which will need to be sanded out if they do occur. Remove the paper within a few minutes after that final coat, and then allow it to dry. Once dry, to smoothen out the transition lines between the primer and paint, or remove any orange peel to level out the surface, block the area with 600 grit sandpaper. When sanding, make sure the filler or the metal does not show through, otherwise this will need to be touched up again. Typically with thicker paints, 400 grit can be used before that final paint coverage, but with thinner or metallic paints, 600 grit should be used. Between the new and old paint transition, where the tape edge will be, use 1000 grit. If you don't fully cover those 1000 grit sanding marks with paint, that isn't an issue, as they are fine enough to be polished out. You'll need to paint at least a couple inches past that repair area where the primer's edge finishes. Clean the area again using denatured alcohol, and then let the product evaporate. Now tape off the area just like previously, laying the paper over the repaired area, and then fold it back over for a soft tape edge, which makes it easier to blend after, making the repair nearly invisible. It's a cooler day, so I warmed up the cans of paint in a bucket of hot water. This helps the paint flow better on the surface. If you have part cans, I would recommend using those first, as they don't always spray nicely due to the lower pressure, or they may only spray in certain angles. For paint, this is a single stage acrylic enamel, which I had mixed at my local auto parts supplier. They were able to mix the color based on the color code I provided from the vehicle, which can be found through the serial number, on the door post, inside the hood, sometimes in the trunk area, or in the glove box. Ensure the paint can is thoroughly mixed and apply a light coat to the surface. Typically I like to get the hard and awkward areas first, then finish up the final coat on the larger, more noticeable sections. This paint does not need a clear coat as it will dry with a gloss finish. Single stage doesn't tend to be as durable, however, there is less work to apply it and it's cheaper. A 2-stage paint requires a base coat applied first, then a clear coat is applied to provide that layer of protection and the final gloss finish, but can be more expensive and slightly more work. Apply the second coat of paint. Considering this is a little cooler today, I'll wait 10 minutes in between coats. At the edges of the taped areas, allow the paint to taper off with overspray so we don't have a hard edge, which would be harder to blend after. I'm not making a huge deal about the overspray on the rest of the truck, as it did get a full paint correction, and I have already released a video for this, so be sure to check it out. Overspray can travel quite a ways, so try to keep the paint away from any other areas which can cause damage. I am applying 3 coats, so I have enough material for wet sanding and polishing. If the paint layer is too thin, then this is a greater chance of sanding through that layer. The final paint layer should be a fully wet finish with no runs. If any runs do occur, they can be sanded out afterwards. Wait about 5 minutes after that final coat and remove the paper. If you wait too long, the paint can harden and you may risk the chance of pulling the paint off the surface. On that tape edge, while the paint is still fresh, it also has a chance to smoothen out. Wait at least a week before wet sanding so the paint has cured enough. Cure times will vary depending on your weather conditions. With the cooler weather, the paint will take longer. Ensure the area is clean and free of any contaminants that may cause damage during the polishing process. Using a bucket of water with a soap mixture, pre-soak the sandpaper. Starting out with 1000 grit sandpaper, this will remove a majority of the orange peel and overspray. Apply a light to medium pressure, working evenly across the surface. A backing pad is recommended as it does apply even pressure to the sandpaper. This can be something like a flexible rubber backer pad or a sponge. With the odd contours on the fender, your hand can be used, but be extremely careful. As you can see with the backing pad, it isn't flexible enough to bend around the contours, so it is leaving marks in certain areas. This is something we need to avoid. With 1000 grit sandpaper, the surface should be fairly smooth, and only light orange peel should be left behind. Moving up to 1500 grit sandpaper, rinse the area and sandpaper of sanding debris from time to time, and the area always needs to be well lubricated with the water and soap mixture. The 1500 grit sandpaper will remove the remaining orange peel. Finish up with 2000 grit sandpaper. You can of course go higher, but I find it isn't needed if you're willing to spend a little extra time with polish and compound. You can go over the original paint with the 2000 grit sandpaper. This will remove some light orange peel and can help blend the area. As a final stage, getting that paint shine back using a polishing compound. This can be done by hand or a machine polisher. This is fresh paint, so polishing by hand would be the safer route. Using a soft cloth, apply the polishing compound and then work it on the surface. I did apply a light mist of water to help the polish work a little easier. There is a variety of products on the market. Workability and quality of finishes can vary. Remove the polish and buff the surface using a microfiber cloth. After a couple minutes, you can see the shine has been fully restored and the transition line is almost invisible. I can lightly see an outline, but after a few more minutes of polishing, it should blend much better. Finishing up with the rest of the fender, being that this is black, it will show imperfections much easier than compared to some other colors, so it can be a bit hard to work with at times. Wax should only be applied once the paint has fully cured. I would wait at least a month to be safe. When polished correctly, this surface will remain shiny, just like the rest of the vehicle. As mentioned at the start of my video, this is a budget repair that will still be durable and last a very long time when done right. If you do want a proper repair, especially if you're restoring a vehicle, cutting out the rust and welding in a patch or replacing the whole panel at the factory body seams is the best route. New videos are released every week on my channel. Be sure to hit that thumbs up button. It's a huge help to me, and leave a comment below if you found this tutorial helpful. Don't forget to follow my social media pages such as Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter to keep up to date with my latest projects. And if you're not a subscriber, be sure to also hit that subscribe button. Thank you for watching.